progressive period really ends with the First World War, and there's an interregnum, if you will, with a few Republican presidents. But of course, this leads to the second wave of liberalism, which we associate with the New Deal. The key figure here, of course, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt himself was a political figure, a former governor, much more practical than Woodrow Wilson, not an academic at all, but very much shaped by progressive intellectual ideas. Many of his writers were progressives from the Wilson administration. FDR famously begins the starts of the welfare state, the modern office of the executive, the strength of the American presidency, and focuses a lot of his work on economic progressivism. A key speech here you might look at is his State of the Union in 1944, where he lays out what he calls the Second Bill of Rights, about economic ideas as a playing out of progressivism in a second phase. A third phase of progressivism we associate with the Great Society. After the New Deal, of course, the Second World War, the 1950s, this breaks into the 1960s with the election of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's assassination leads to the presidency of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson himself was very much a New Dealer, but in turn shaped by progressive ideas. He wants to do better than the New Deal by being more aggressive, more progressive than his own predecessors, in many ways harkening back to the original concept of the progressives themselves. Here we associate the Great Society with what? Social progress. This is when government is now growing rapidly, building on the New Deal, but being involved in more things, education, the environment, many more economic regulations, developing many more programs and activities. The Great Society continues on through the Nixon administration as well as the Ford administration. In many ways it was bipartisan. And then the fourth wave, and here I'll put a question mark, is what is going on now with President Obama. He clearly would like to think of himself as a great figure of liberalism in light of the Great Society, the New Deal, and progressives, but in ways continue it and making it larger and going in a different direction. So far, the great thing associated with this is Obamacare, the health care legislation, which is a very large piece of social legislation, indeed the largest piece of social legislation since the Great Society, having to do with the health care system. Healthcare ideas were something the Great Society was interested in, but also the New Deal, and it goes all the way back to progressives. Getting control of and regulating healthcare is a key objective of the progressives' waves over time. Now, the question is, what is and how does this relate to conservatism? And here I'd like to begin and use my same outline of the four waves of liberalism and talk about its beginnings in a slightly different way. Later, we're going to be talking about in your other sessions various aspects of it and various very important figures in the modern conservative movement. But I would suggest to you that the conservative movement in many ways begins in response to this first progressive wave, at least the very beginnings, the seeds, if you will, of modern progressivism. Indeed, I would suggest the conservative movement actually begins in 1912, which is to say that the first time we believe and we start thinking about a need to conserve something is when the thing we wish to conserve, the American idea, is fundamentally threatened by something else, namely the progressive movement. And so it's only in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson is elected, they begin to see the beginnings of this. And indeed, in 1912, one of the key battles there is not the election itself, but control of the Republican Party, when figures like Henry Cabot Lodge and Elihu Root fight over control of the party because they want to prevent Teddy Roosevelt, the other great figure of the early progressive movement, from gaining control of their party. And so they prevent him from getting control of that party. And as we all know, Teddy Roosevelt bolts. He leaves the Republican Party, runs as a bull-moose progressive, and that's how Woodrow Wilson wins the presidency. That's round one, I would say, of the conservative movement. They are first realizing something is afoot. You have to understand, we don't have the context and the hindsight. They're seeing Teddy Roosevelt's attack on the Constitution, and they want to stop it. That's the start. It's only then after the New Deal that you begin to see the beginnings of intellectual conservatism with some of the great figures you're going to study later. It's after the Great Society when the New Right and other figures come into the conservative movement. 1964 with Barry Goldwater, eventually to Ronald Reagan. And then today, of course, conservatism is trying to figure out where is it going, what are its roots, and how does it revive itself. Let me conclude, if I would, by going back to those early progressives and those early conservatives who went up against those progressives and suggest that there might be a place to look in terms of trying to decide where our future is. I want to quote from Calvin Coolidge. For anyone who knows me but also knows my work on early conservatives and progressives, Calvin Coolidge is a great hero and should be to any conservative. I consider him probably one of the greatest thinkers about these ideas, especially at the time. Here is something he wrote on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1926. Again, a speech easy to find on the internet. About the Declaration, remember this is the anniversary of the Declaration, so that's his topic. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1976. Again, like Woodrow Wilson earlier, listen to his words and you know what he's talking about. That we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond those propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary founders. It is in that grounding, that challenge to progressivism that we see in Calvin Coolidge, that we see the philosophical as well as the practical seeds of what would become modern conservatism. That despite its rhetoric, progressivism is actually backwards. And that it is conservatism, grounded in permanent principles and political prudence, which is actually forward-looking, respects and supports a limited government, a framework of opportunity and self-government, and leads to human flourishing. And let me just close by closing and ending with the end of Coolidge's speech. He has just talked in that speech mostly about the religious and theological and social influences on the American founding, the spiritual development and the great moral power of America. No theory is adequate to explain or comprehend the Declaration, he concludes. It is the product of the spiritual insight of the people. We live in an age of science and of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our Declaration created them. The things of the Spirit come first. Unless we cling to that, all our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may appear, will turn to a barren scepter in our grasp. If we are to maintain the great heritage which has been bequeathed to us, we must be like-minded as the fathers who created it. We must not sink into pagan materialism. We must cultivate the reverence which they had for the things which are holy. We must follow the spiritual and moral leadership which they showed. We must keep replenished that they may glow with a more compelling flame, the altar fires before which they worshipped. That's Calvin Coolidge, the greatest critic of modern progressivism, about which we must learn in order to be good conservatives.